Well, welcome everyone to our first interview and conversation of March 2025. With us today is Dr. Nick Patterson, mathematician at the Broad Institute in Massachusetts. His work at archaeogenetics has been seminal, including the sequencing of the Neanderthal genome and work on the genetic origin and spread of early Indo-European speaking peoples, which is the topic of today's conversation, in which we are also joined by my old friend and colleague, Professor Tony Yates of UCLA's Indo-European and Near Eastern languages. So without further ado about this, Dr. Patterson, what can you tell us about genetics and the spread of Indo-European right now?
Well, I hope I can tell you quite a lot, but I want to say that this is some personal opinions, and I haven't tried to provide a formal lecture. I don't have maps, and what I'm really hoping to do is go through pretty much the entire spread of Indo-European. I'm trying to handle the entire phylogeny, obviously rather quickly.
Mhm.
Uh, my personal opinions about what happened. Um, I try and indicate what I'm pretty sure about and what I'm less sure about. And what I'm hoping is that there'll be a discussion and maybe some disagreement. And anyone who's on the webinar should aggressively use the chat to write in Q&A.
All right.
I don't want to pile everything up to the end. There's too much stuff.
Sure. Mm.
Um, okay, so let me begin. Um, the story, I think, begins um, a long time, really a long time ago. All dates are, by the way, BCE.
Mm.
Uh, I don't want to keep saying that because that's where all the action is. So my story, I think, begins on the Volga River in the 6th millennium. Of course, the real story goes back infinitely far, pretty much, because whatever language these people were talking, they got it from somebody else, and so on and so forth, right?
Mm.
So, really, uh, I think linguistic history must go back to the beginning of humanity, but uh, in the sufficiently distant past, we probably can never know.
Mm.
So, anyway, there are extensive settlements on the Volga River in the around 50 or 500. And interestingly, there's a systematic change in the genetics as you move upriver. Um, and it's very clear that what's going on is the genetics in the lower Volga, which is near the Caspian Sea, are pretty different from the genetics 1,000 miles away. The Volga is a very long river. But people are moving up and down, and this causes some mixing.
Mm.
And um, they're living, but they're fishing, pretty much. So travel is pretty easy along the river by boat, and that's what they're doing, I'm sure. Um, and there's a settlement on the lower Volga, Berezovka, um, and around 4,500 BC, um, some of these people move into the northern Caucasus. And we have a site with a very Soviet name of Prospect 2. I assume that was an English translation, but it's not. It's the actual Russian name of the site.
Mm.
And the genetics of Prospect 2 and the genetics of Berezovka are essentially identical. So much so that we must have samples only 1 or 2 generations after the move, I think. Um, then the next thing that happens is some of these people um, and maybe a little Armenian from a little genetics from Armenia or somewhere further south move into eastern Ukraine. If I believe, this is my language, I think some linguists use this, but not all. Proto-Indo-European for me is an ancestral language of all Indo-European languages, including Hittite.
All right.
Late Proto-Indo-European is all Indo-European languages except Hittite and Anatolian, and Tocharian is a little bit. I put Tocharian in with the late Proto-Indo-European. So this movement into the eastern Ukraine is an extremely strong candidate for the split of Anatolian and everybody else. See, my belief is that everybody else is descended pretty much from these Caucasus people, or more specifically from the guys in eastern Ukraine, and the people left behind their languages would have diverged, and I think that's where the split happened. Incidentally, and rather romantically, and it's sort of irrelevant, but it's too good a story not to tell. We have we have an Armenian site of the right period, which looks like it's sort of got the right genetics. It's a remarkable site. It's a cave which looks like producing industrial quantities of wine. There's a huge sort of a pot where they're making the wine, and in quantities that are hard to, I would not have been for their own use, I think.
Hmm.
And the cave roof has collapsed, and we have a woman's shoe left behind in the site. And the story, which is rather clear and quite amazing, is that what they're doing is pressing grapes with their feet, which is a well-known thing to do, right? You stamp on the grapes right? And of
Hmm.
course you take your shoes off. And then the cave, the roof started to collapse. We don't know if they managed to get out or not. But the lady owner of the shoe got out of the cave, or maybe was killed, and she never got to put a shoe on.
I mean, it's
Pretty
amazing.
amazing story. I really had to tell that. Um, and around 4,000, the date's a little fuzzy in my mind. We get a culture forms in Ukraine, the Shredny Sti. That's the Ukrainian name. If you read David Anthony's book, that's the same as the Shredny Stag, which is the Russian name. And this culture forms, and it's got a mixture for these guys from the Caucasus and the people we call Ukraine Neolithic, who were there before. And that mixture can be dated genetically. And it wasn't a surprise to the archaeologists that something like that happened. And in my opinion, it's almost certain the Shredny Steed people spoke Indo-European.
Hmm.
So that's the initial story of the origins. So let's move forward, unless there's questions or comments.
I have just a small one, Nick.
Okay.
I like your terminology, and I wonder uh, how come you can't persuade your collaborators to use Proto-Indo-European for the top of the tree? Because this is really
No, well, as you probably know, the word Proto-Indo-European is in the literature, it seems to me quite ambiguous,
Mhm.
right? I mean,
Uh,
you talk about, for example, there are numerous articles reconstructing Proto-Indo-European but ignoring Hittite.
yes. I mean, right, there's this split between people who want some kind of a high, like, in the Proto-Indo-Anatolian or the traditional label Proto-Indo-Hittite for I mean, I shouldn't say the traditional one that goes back some time. Um,
Yeah. So
but
anyway, I have no dog in this fight at all. It's
I just
just
think it's a shit.
It's just best to be unambiguous as to what
I do agree. Yeah. No, I completely agree with the lack of it. That might be the only point in favor of this other terminology. I guess my feeling is that the people who really like the term Proto-Indo-Anatolian or before that Proto-Indo-Hittite are the kind of people who favor. They're usually the kind of people who think Anatolian is extremely divergent and favor a very, very early date for the common origin of the Indo-Europeans, and they're sort of the kind of people who would prefer a homeland in Anatolia, which is obviously precisely what we're sort of arguing against
yeah.
here.
Incidentally, the Indo-Europeanists who I've talked to most um, uh, over the years is Don Ringe,
Mhm.
and Ringe I think is a hugely smart guy, and he told me that uh, in before you get sort of seriously large cultures, a typical linguistic unit or homeland is quite small. I mean,
Mhm.
uh, maybe 10,000 square miles. That's like a sort of 100 by 100 miles square. And you
Mhm.
don't really, I mean, you move outside that, the languages are going to shift a lot.
Hmm.
So if you place early Indo-European in Anatolia very early, you've got to find some mechanism for getting them in other places. And
Mhm.
I don't think there's a good mechanism. Uh,
Mhm.
um, anyway, let me move on. And
Yeah, of course.
and 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 I want to talk about Anatolia, um, which is one of the. There's still some ambiguity, I think. Um, uh, I little doubt at all that Anatolian originates from these Caucasus people, but there is some ambiguity as to get to how they get to what's now Western Turkey. What we want from the genetics is that the Caucasus people move into Eastern Anatolia. We see the signs of that, and we have some genetic data there. And interestingly, there's some mixing from the Fertile Crescent. There's some Mesopotamian stuff in there at this time, and then pushed, and uh, then get pushed further west. Um, I've got this very great, very, very speculative that it's a culture called Kura-Araxes of Pushon. I talk about that a little bit at the bottom of the slide. The problem there is that uh, there's no in the around 2000 BC when the Hittite Empire forms, uh, we don't see any sign of Indo-European in Eastern Anatolia. There's a whole bunch of Anatolian cultures that are speaking Anatolian languages, but all all in the West. So the linguists that I know of want Anatolian to come in, want Indo-European to show up in Anatolia from the West, right? That naturally explains the distribution we see. But the genetics don't look good for this at all. Um, the You would expect, if that were true, that uh, it would come in through the Balkans, presumably, and it would have acquired some genetics from third millennium Eastern Europe, which we just don't see. So it doesn't look good. Um, but a complication here is that it's not clear we have any genetic data from true Hittites. Um, the There's a paper you may know by I think Bangard is the lead author, which I don't like very much. It talks about Hittite genetics, um, but their samples are supposedly Hittites. Um, Appear from the archaeology could probably be Assyrian traders. who were in the Hittite Empire and then died. Well, that can't tell you anything at all, really, about it. Those people wouldn't have been speaking Indo-European, so um, it's not too helpful. Um, and there's a very good appendix to this paper, which taught me a lot, by Gush Kuhnen, arguing that the Hittite Empire was multicultural and multilinguistic, right?
Mhm.
So, given that, what we're really interested in genetically is people for whom Hittite was their mother tongue. But don't know. I mean, presumably the elite would have been the actual, the rulers of the empire. You could expect, but we don't have any. We don't have any DNA. The Hittite elite cremated their dead, which is very annoying.
Mhm.
Um,
Do, do you mind a comment here? I'm just a couple, I mean, a couple of small points. I mean, I don't want to
yeah,
interrupt
no,
it. I
totally.
mean, we can
I think there's
circle.
plenty of time.
Yeah. So, so maybe just a couple of small things. And one is, yeah, I do think you're right that linguists have traditionally favored this in from the West, but it's not really based on very much linguistic evidence. I think it's more just, right, this is where we find the languages. And so, when they first show up, and so it's just a matter of kind of economy, and that's not that's not very that's not a very strong argument, frankly. And I suppose insofar as the linguistic arguments are real linguistic arguments are brought to bear, it's sort of the absence of early loanwords from Semitic or other sort of other ancient languages of the Near East into in the early stages of Hittite and Luwian. And but this too is like this is evidence from absence, and there may be alternative explanations for that. And actually,
Sure.
in very recent years, very recently, actually, I was at a presentation by one of my a colleague. I don't know how sort of you know how quiet this research is meant to be. I don't believe it's published yet, but a colleague arguing for a very early loanword going the opposite direction from Hittite into the Semitic languages at a very early stage.
Well,
So
that's
perhaps
interesting
that's not
because
really.
it
Yeah.
seemed from our work that would be quite plausible because there's no doubt, I think, that in the say 3000 BCE, I don't remember the exact date now, we have what I would guess are Proto-Hittite speakers in what's now Eastern Turkey, in
Mhm.
contact with the Semitic people. Mm.
Mhm.
So that would be, I mean, some linguistic consequence of that is very plausible. Um,
Yeah,
so
I agree.
here's my scenario for what happened. It's just highly speculative, but it sort of makes sense. So you get Indo-European speakers in what's now Eastern Turkey, um, probably in the late fourth millennium, let's say 3100, 3200, right? Around this time, the dominant culture in the Caucasus is a culture called Kura-Araxes, um, who we have genetics. Their genetics are not good for Indo-European. I don't believe they're Indo-European speakers.
Mhm.
Uh, the Kura-Araxes culture collapses. Not completely clear why, and there's a mass exodus. So you get people moving south, and some of them move into Turkey, and some of them move into what's now Iran. And so my theory is that these people come into what's now Eastern Turkey and push out the people who are already there, right? And that would push the Indo-Europeans into Western Turkey, which is where we find them 1,000 years later.
I think that sounds plausible. If I may insert a comparison here, Algonquian languages largely are found in northeastern North America, but in the West, we have Arapaho and Cheyenne isolated from other Algonquian languages, and one might look at that without realizing the connection and wonder, well, how did they get here? But presumably something like that has happened in their history too. They began somewhere further east, and were gradually pushed in that direction. And as far as there not being very many early loan words from Semitic languages into Hittite, I would think that another analogy there might be Greek and Phoenician, where you had very early trading contacts, but not very much, not many loan words in either direction. People who just have a business relationship with each other, they may not
Right.
trade much vocabulary.
Off topic, but we have lots of Punic and Greek, colonial Greek um, data, and there's a very interesting cultural difference. In the Punic colonies, say in Spain, there's a lot of intermarriage with the local people. You see genetic dilution with what's there, and the Greeks, none at all.
Hmm.
So it's very clear that the Greek culture is not intermixing with the local people, but the Punics are. And I think that's, I don't think the archaeologists knew that, but genetics seem to make it very obvious.
That's very interesting.
Yeah. So let me move on. So now we come to what's really the crux.
I would consider.
Yeah. Um, so the Yamnaya, this major culture on the steppe, they developed genetically from Shrednisti. The so if as a geneticist, I could call them late Shrednisti, and that would be correct. But the culture is extremely different. In particular, the Yamnaya able to build very large wagons, which would have been pulled by oxen. I was sort of amazed. My archaeology friends tell me that these wagons could hold 2 tons of stuff. You know, and given that you have very simple tools, probably copper tools to make these things, wooden wheels and axles, and you've got to be able to drive them across the steppe, which is sort of flat, but it's not, like a golf course, right? And you've got to be able to do that, and the wheels mustn't jam all the time. And they managed to make this work. Uh, and of course, if you have wagons in that sort of environment, that's a huge advantage. The steppe grassland is very thin, so you're grazing animals, and every month or month and a half, the animals will have eaten all the grass locally, and you have to move on. Right? And obviously, you probably have a big tent or yurt or something like that you can put in the wagon. You put your young kids in the back of the wagon. Um, it's not really practical to operate in these lands without that. The Yamnaya bury their dead, or at least their elite dead, in kurgans, which are these large earth mounds. That's actually why we know about these people. The kurgans are extremely easy the steppe's basically flat. And you can stand on the steppe to this day and look out, and there are the kurgans. Really easy to spot. Something sort of scary about our knowledge of history is I think if the Yamnaya dispose of their dead differently, say by cremation, we might not even know about the culture. They'd be pretty much archaeologically invisible. There aren't any settlements, so how would we find them?
That is, in a way, a chilling thought for scholarship, actually. And
Yeah,
how many cultures do
yeah,
we not know about?
yeah, right. There could be major things happening in history which haven't left an archaeological trace.
Hmm.
Um, and extremely controversially, they may have had horses or were riding horses. Um, my friend and colleague David Anthony strongly believes this. The majority opinion probably now is that he's wrong, and he's currently writing a rebuttal arguing his case. So no. It's an important issue because the Yamnaya are an astonishingly successful culture, And you kind of need to explain why they were so successful. I also think that they had a very strong clan structure, um, uh, patrilocal clans. So the men stay put, and the women probably compulsorily into marry out. And I think they were very violent. There's I think there's a lot of clan warfare. Um, a scary thing actually about their history is as I'm going to come to, uh, they expand enormously far to the east, and the genetics don't change at all. There's no sign of intermixing in the east with the people living in river valleys and so on there before. I think they were exterminated, frankly. Mm? Um, mm? Um, and it's also important, probably, certainly the genetics, and probably even to the linguistics, that around 3,500, oh, the Yamnaya flourished like 3,000 or maybe a little earlier, but about 3,500, there was an extreme bottleneck, which means, I think, that the Yamnaya descend from only one or two Shredni Sti clans, right? Um, the A lot of the natural story is that there was some inventions made. Perhaps there was a genius carpenter in one of these clans who figured out how to make wagons, and that was an enormous advantage, and that group just took over, something like that.
An appealing story, impossible to know, right? But
Yeah, we'll never know. But certainly somebody, you know, that certainly somebody invented, or the group figured out how to make these really quite difficult objects. Um,
and what is the case for or against their having horses? I mean, I can think of a linguistic case that they did. The
well, they
shared.
certainly knew about. There's no question they knew about the horse. The question is, what are they using them for? Huh? Um, and uh, David Anthony thinks, first of all, he's found evidence of bit wear on the teeth. And a little later, I think like 2700, there's a related culture, Poltavka, where we have a number of skeletons where uh, apparently if you basically if you ride horses all the time, it causes your sort of legs to bend in a rather characteristic way. Mm? And you see this, apparently he sees the evidence of this in some of the fossils. Mm?
Huh.
On the other hand, modern horses um, clearly all descend from a small group in about 2200 BC, much later, um, and they appear to be mutations, making them more docile.
Hmm.
But that doesn't disprove Anthony, from my opinion. The uh, I mean, those later horses obviously came from somewhere, and a major component may have been the Yamnaya horses. It's not clear to me. This is something the right lab hasn't worked on itself, but I intend to do that if I can. It's an important question. Um,
I
the
imagine there must be some archaeogenetic data on horses now.
Yes, that's
If we,
right. Exactly.
right?
Yeah, right. The um, uh, uh, there's a very good geneticist, Ludovic Orlando, who's a specialist on this. Um, and but I would like to do some work in our lab too. Um, the Incidentally, it's very unlikely at this time that they were fighting on horseback.
Hmm.
The horses the horses would have probably been too skittish to
Hmm.
make that a reasonable proposition. But that doesn't mean it wasn't a huge military advantage. Um, if you can ride, that gives you extreme mobility. And any military guy will tell you that's key. There's a famous quote from a Southern Civil War general, Bedford Forrest, that war is get there fastest with the mostest.
Well, and both and horses and wagons and wheels are a major aspect of doing that in the Copper Age and the Bronze Age.
Yeah. The Yamnaya probably were not the inventors of wheeled vehicles.
Hmm.
There's carts and so on in Eastern Europe, and I think in the Caucasus a little earlier. But these were light vehicles and probably major features of the culture. Okay, so now we come to the Yamnaya expansion. This is uh, one of the most amazing events in the whole of human history for me. Um, so it's around 3000, and two things happen very similarly in time. First of all, there's a movement west into Eastern Europe, and a culture well known to archaeologists, the corded ware form. Um, they're 70, 80, maybe even 90% Yamnaya genetics, with the remainder from farmers in Europe who were there before. And there's also movement from the east, onto the Volga River, and then further east, all the way to Siberia, an enormous distance. That forms a culture well known to archaeologists called the Afanasyevo in Western Siberia. Astonishingly, the genetics of the Afanasyevo, a huge distance away, are identical to the Yamnaya on the Volga River. In fact, we have the Afanasyevo seem to be equally related to people on the Volga River as settlements on the Volga are even to people even inside the same settlement.
Remarkable. So that's a
I
very
think,
fast movement.
we even have as direct proof. We have cousins. I think that's probably second cousins. One of the Yamnaya genetics. One of the cousins is in Hungary, and the other one is in Siberia. The I've talked to. I even think it's possible that the movement into Siberia took 2 years, no longer. We can't prove that, but if they knew where they were going, and they almost certainly did, and when you're moving your herds, you just steadily move them east. Every time you move them east. Then my archaeological experts say that would take 2 summers. Huh?
Well, that would be consistent with the extremely close genetic profiles at that
Right.
immense distance.
Yeah. Yeah. It's quite an astonishing story. I can't quite think of a parallel if no moving that fast so quickly.
What is the distance roughly?
You should look it up, but it's got to be 1,000 miles, and the Volga
Hmm.
River is not near Ukraine either.
Hmm.
Huh? So these people are really mobile. And there's also movement, although I'm hazier about it, into oh, I've got to type it. No, not clear. I sort of know. There's movement south into Armenia, but it seems to be a bit patchy, and we don't have very good genetic data, I don't think. Anyway, more may be known about that than I know. But some steppe genetics winds up in southern Caucasus and Armenia at this time.
Hmm.
Now here's a genetic problem. On the Y chromosome, just transmitted by males, pretty much every Yamnaya male has R1b, a particular haplotype. of the Y chromosome. And coded where have R1A, a couple of scattered R1Bs, but it's basically all R1A. And what has that? The genetics of the autosomes, outside the Y chromosome are a totally clear match to the model I have of Yamnaya plus European ancestry. So something's going on. Well, the first problem is where did this R1A come from? And there's no direct evidence. If you go back, say, to 4000 BC, we don't have any R1A samples. But the genetics shows that the haplotype is much older than that. It's probably dates back 10,000 years. So there are R1A people living somewhere in 4000 BC, but we don't know where. So here's two theories for how you resolve this problem. David Anthony speculates that you had a revolution in that you have a stratified society and the underclass somehow stage a revolution as they move into Europe and take over. And we wouldn't know about their genetics on the steppe because the Kurgans were only for elite, right? I mean, a big Kurgan is about a man-year of work. You aren't going to do that for a peasant,
Right.
And my theory is a simpler one: is that there's a patrilocal Yamnaya clan that has R1A, and we just haven't found it. I mean, that's a sort of boring answer, but it's not obviously wrong. Anyway, there's definitely a problem there.
Well,
Right.
by Occam's razor, I mean, as you point out, there must be cultures and peoples that we have no direct evidence from. So it's a simple economical explanation for it. I don't know exactly what a revolution looks like in a society like this, but
Well, I mean, it's a hierarchical society. You can always change who the bosses are.
suppose the middle moves to the top.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that's yeah. I mean, it doesn't. I don't know. I don't know what the historical parallels are, but I suspect there are some. Um, yeah. All right. So now I want to talk about Tocharian. Um, a prime candidate, in my view, and other people's view too, for the split of Tocharian and the other late Proto-Indo-European languages is this movement into the Altai and Siberia. It's a long way away. There aren't any really intermediate settlements, we think, that are close. So once they got to Siberia, they would have been isolated. And the date fits pretty well, I think. I think a lot of linguists think that the date is appropriate. And of course, that puts Indo-European speakers in the East. Now, you probably know a bit about Tocharian. We have writing around the turn to the Common Era. I think some of it's a little earlier, most is later. That's Buddhist scriptures written in Tocharian in Chinese characters, but it's phonetically. You read the characters phonetically. It's Indo-European. And of course,
Mostly, sorry, if
sorry?
it's really, I think it's really Sanskrit characters mostly. It's
Thank you.
yeah,
Okay.
is but mostly, yes, yeah.
Yeah.
Sorry, just to
No, okay. I'm not a Hungarian expert, I can
no,
assure
it's
you.
okay. Just
Yeah,
but it's
but
but they're translations of
because of
Sanskrit
some of
Buddhist.
this,
Yeah,
yeah, some of this stuff is well-known Buddhist scriptures in other languages. It's that's a kind of Rosetta Stone. once you've identified the sutra, the scripture that they're writing in, you have a Rosetta Stone in another language. Um, uh, there's no real genetic evidence linking Tocharian to Afanasievo. Um, and we haven't really got any evidence for Yamnaya genetics in Western China south of the huge mountain range, the Tian Shan. But there's plenty of, uh, we're talking 2,500 years after the Afanasievo. There's an awful lot of time to cross the mountains. And my opinion is that Afanasievo is indeed Proto-Tocharian, basically because I can't think of any other plausible hypothesis. Right? You've got to have highly diverged Indo-European speakers who essentially stay isolated, right? And I don't see any other plausible route. By the way, and you ought to know this, or everybody on the call, my friend and colleague Jim Mallory, um, who's a real polymath. I mean, he knows all this stuff quite very well. Is writing a book on Indo-European, which is supposed to be out, I think, by mid-year. And I don't really know what his take on all of this is, but he has written a monograph some years ago. It's now out of date, as I'm sure he'd admit.
In
On
Search of the Indo-Europeans. It's kind of a classic
oh
in
no,
the field.
that wasn't that's very old. Um,
Yeah, yeah,
uh,
yeah. There's about, let's
no,
say it's
I
a,
was going to say
yes.
he's written a monograph. It was precisely on the origin of Tocharian.
Oh, I see. Sorry. Apologies.
So
Yes,
that's right.
thank
That's
you.
right. And it's of course out of date now. Um, and uh, Mallory is a very interesting guy. I admire his style. He um, he's got a very characteristic style in which he writes down what he thinks happened. And then he writes down all the arguments about why he might be wrong. And so he writes about Tocharian. He says it's probably Afanasievo, and then he points out all the difficulties. Um, but I'm not sure what his current opinions are, but I certainly am eager to find out.
Me
Um,
too. He's a UCLA guy, of course. So, this is uh,
yeah.
this is a common thread for us. Can I just ask a question about this Tocharian thing? Just maybe I don't. I'm not sure it's one there's an answer to, but is there any way to get at this question? Like, what would we need to like? Are we just is it just the dates are too late for Tocharian, or is there any hope of finding something that would
Well,
sort of connect them?
one can hope that uh, I mean the ancient genetic data here is patchy, right? I mean, uh, it's greatly improving. Actually, the Chinese are now working hard on this. But in Europe, we have very extensive archaeology, uh, and it's probably unlikely that we're missing a heck of a lot in Europe in the last, I would say, 3,000 years archaeologically. But I don't think that's really true in the East. And I mean, a I think that a smoking gun, or very, very close, will be to find early steppe genetics south of the Tian Shan. Right? If you did that, I think it's pretty much case over. But until then, we don't really know. Yeah. But I'm hopeful. I did actually. I wasn't. I was. I'm curious about the following. It's very, very thin evidence, but it's not nothing. I've been working with some archaeologists on ancient Ladakh in the Himalaya in India, and apparently there's a lot of rock art on Ladakh where people are scratching stuff on rocks. And my archaeology friend thinks there's rock art in Ladakh that's derived from rock art in Afanasievo.
Hmm.
Um, if that's correct, that's really very interesting because at least it puts some culture having moved a long, long way south.
Right. And Harvard's Daniel Tabin in the chat points to a paper in Current Biology suggesting genetic connections between Afanasyevo and Tocharian. Ancient genomes reveal Yamnaya-related ancestry and a potential source of Indo-European speakers in Iron Age Tian Shan.
Oh, that's it. I okay. I don't think I knew that. Um, the could you do me a favor
Hmm.
and after the talk, send me email with the exact link.
Sure, it's also in the chat here.
Oh,
Daniel
good.
says he'll send it to you.
Yeah. Anyway, I find I find cutting and pasting in chat rather difficult.
All right.
So if you send me email, I'd regard that I'd appreciate that.
Sure. Daniel says he'll send it to you.
Okay, good. That's all right. That's yeah. So maybe that's maybe that we're getting there. Um, uh, and as I say, it sort of has to be true because what else is there? Um, all right. So next part of the story. Um, around I think we're going okay for time. Around 2400. Corded ware people moved back onto the steppe. Now, notice the corded ware have picked up this European farmer genetics. So these people are now genetically distinct from the Yamnaya, 700 years ago. And a bunch of cultures form. Um, Shwabnaya, Sintashta, Andronovo, there are others. Now, as you know, you can tell I pitched this talk very much on linguistic aim because I know your interest there. Uh, there's a remarkable sound change which you'll know about, the Rukhi shift, which seems to link Indo-Iranian and Balto-Slavic. And I can remember 5 or 6 years ago, I was reading about this. I remember looking at a map of Eurasia, and the Baltics and India are not exactly close. And I'm scratching my head. How the heck can there be a linguistic link here?
Mhm.
But actually, what I'm going to tell you, it beautifully explains this. These people moved back into the steppe, and some of them moved north and maybe a little west into the Baltics, and some of them eventually moved south into India. And that explains the link.
Mhm.
So if you posit that the shift occurs very early in the back migration, that fits the facts beautifully. And certainly, the Rukhi shift is not universally thought to be a common thing, but at least some people. Don Ringe tells me this is a very unlikely sound change. It's not really very plausible. It would have happened more than once in history.
And
You know,
and
sound changes like B's and P's, merge or something.
right.
Apparently happen multiple, many, many times. But this is sort of weird. Um, anyway, that's a linguistic thing that I think we're explaining.
And can it be that Germanic, which has some characteristics in common with Indo-Iranian and Balto-Slavic, I mean, especially if we're following Renge's model, is descended from some of the constellation of dialects spoken by corded
Yeah,
ware people who
yeah,
aren't moving back east?
yeah. I believe I jump in. I have one line on Germanic. I don't really know, and I suspect it's complicated. I actually suspect that Germanic has multiple Indo-European sources,
Hmm.
and they're sort of merged. I mean, it makes the linguistic phylogeny very hard to figure out.
Something like that is suggested by Renge too.
Yeah, I know, but he's my main source.
Yeah.
What Indo-European linguistics I know mostly comes from Don.
Hmm.
Um, the okay. Now I come to what I think is the most crucial evidence of my whole talk. So the Zatashta culture is very interesting. Um, they seem to have made their living as metal workers. Um, uh, Pretty much every Sintashta house has a metal forge in it, and they have to be making metal goods and selling or bartering them. They're making more metal than they need for themselves, for sure. And they appear to be the inventors of the chariot, the horse-drawn chariot, and as a war weapon, that was the super weapon in the second millennium BC. I mean, chariots were very expensive, but obviously extremely effective. You know, Hittites, Egyptians, all the big empires had to have chariots in that period. It was crucial. The metalworking is crucial. You have to be able to make very light metal wheels.
Mhm.
You can't make a war chariot that's effective from wooden wheels. It's actually clear that these people spoke Proto-Indo-Iranian. And there's 3 completely independent lines of evidence. First of all, the Russian archaeologists have been saying this for 20 years. Amazingly, Sintashta has a ritual horse burial that seems to follow a Vedic ritual.
And
That's kind of astonishing to me.
and for those who aren't aware of where this is, Sintashta is in the central southern Russia, just north of Kazakhstan. It is nowhere close to India.
Right. But so the Russians have been seeing signs of Vedic culture believe they've spotted this a long time ago. Then the second thing, which is a linguistic argument, is Uralic linguists. Uralic is a huge non-Indo-European family, mostly spoken in the north, all the way from Siberia to Finland today. Uralic linguists have identified more than 100 Proto-Indo-Iranian loanwords into Uralic. And they're people I trust who are very, very careful and quite confident about this. And it's not just Indo-European, it's Indo-Iranian, which is very important to me. And amazingly, because linguistic dates, oh, sorry, I made a mistake. Let me get back. Yeah, usually linguistic dates are very hard to make precise, but they can date this to 2400 to 2000. And the reason they can do that is really very interesting. Around this time, Uralic is starting to break up into different languages, and you can identify the different language groups from different archaeological cultures. And the archaeologists can date these cultures. So you have these obviously Uralic-speaking cultures that have started to separate culturally and start to accumulate with sound changes. And you can then tell that a loanword has arrived into Uralic after a particular sound change has occurred. And so they get this date quite precisely. And finally, there's a paper by Vagishna, Narasimhan, and myself, which identifies Sintashta and Andronovo as the West Eurasian source in Indian genetics today. As far as I can tell, even more remarkably, none of these 3 lines of evidence, we didn't know about each other's work at the time I did it. I actually feel I hadn't read the Russian literature carefully, which I should have done. And the Uralic stuff only happened after we wrote our paper. I think our paper is 2022, and the Uralic linguists is 23. And I don't think the linguists really knew about our paper. So you have 3 lines of evidence, all saying exactly the same thing. There's essentially no way it's wrong. So I think Indo-European gets into India about 1900. But the evidence of the date is rather thin. but it's interesting that the Indus Valley civilization, a major civilization in world history, that flourishes for about 2600 to 1900 and then collapses for we don't understand why. Um, there's no real evidence of violence in the cities. There's no destruction of buildings or burning or stuff like that. Um, but I think there's a connection. Um, exactly what I don't know. Um, highly speculative, but maybe very relevant. It could even be relevant to Yamna expansion. Is an astonishing discovery was made uh, oh, nearly 10 years ago now, not by our group, but our different genetic group, showing that on the Bronze Age steppe, there's bubonic plague. And what's more, it seems to be endemic. I mean, it was um, so that could actually be a cause of what's going on. If the steppe people have some resistance to plague, as they travel around, they move this stuff. Um, that could cause pretty dramatic demographic effects.
Right, without the signs of violence, right?
Yes, yes.
And it could precede large population movements of that steppe genetics into an area, as all it would take is some people coming in
Yes.
contact with some
So
people.
one, so a possible scenario, which could have happened multiple places and times, is a few people show up. I mean, maybe just even a trader, right? One or two guys. They bring these nasties with them. Um, there's then a huge epidemic. The civilization sort of collapses and can't resist more systematic movement in. Mhm. That's possible, but it's very, very speculative. We just don't know. I mean, you could dream that you'll find a plague pit, Indus Valley plague pit or something like that. But, certainly not. We haven't done that. Mhm.
Mhm.
Um,
Is
okay.
there genetic data for the Indus Valley, that the Indus
Oh,
Valley
well,
civilization?
good question. Um, we have one sample of extremely poor quality that my colleagues worked on incredibly hard. Um, I think something like more than a man-year went into just a single sample trying to get DNA from it. And we got a little bit, enough to see that it doesn't seem to have any step ancestry.
Hmm.
Uh, and we also, my Vigeesh and my paper have quite a number of samples, like a dozen, of what we call Indus Valley periphery.
Hmm.
These are samples found outside the Indus Valley that look like they've got Indian genetics. For example, uh, a there was a culture at the time, the BMAC, the Bactria Margia archaeological complex, major culture uh, in Tajikistan. They have a big city there called Gonu, and there's a baby, a 2-year-old child, buried in a pot. That's obviously got Indian genetics, no step ancestry, and a natural story is that the child's parents were traders or had some other reason to move to this culture, right? And while they were there, their child died.
Mhm.
But it's conjectural. I mean, what you'd like to have is real, truly identifiable Indus Valley samples. And we haven't got that really.
I see.
We're looking. It's extremely high on my priority list.
Hmm.
Huh?
But the physical environment must make it hard for
Yeah,
remains.
right. I think that's true. Um, uh, but it's not hopeless. And uh, we uh, and actually Indus Valley, the most of the Indus Valley civilization is what's in now modern Pakistan. And I'll just mention in passing, the politics are very, very different.
Uh-huh.
Um, it's very hard these days to get to get ancient samples out of India.
Mhm.
It is politically very hot, very, very controversial there. But in Pakistan, less so. So we may be able to do that. Anyway, we're working on it. Okay, how many time gone?
It
Yeah,
is,
I'm doing okay.
yeah.
Next thing, um, and I just want to make a thing in passing. Uh, you might think naively that the more recent time you go, the easier it is would be to see what happened. The samples tend to be better quality. There are more sites. There's more of them. But in fact, working on the genetic history of Europe after about 2000 BC is harder than the genetics before. And the reason is very simple. There's much less genetic differentiation. When the steppe people come in 3000 BC, their genetics are way different from what was in Europe before that. Right? So it becomes technically extremely easy to figure out that steppe genetics has shown up, right? But after about 2000 BC, the genetics in Europe in 2000 BC resemble, if not exact, the genetics in Europe today, right? And it makes it much harder to see what's going on.
Because every population has a mixture of both steppe ancestry and
Yeah, I
North
mean,
ancestry.
so for example, with uh, um, when Norman French invaded England, the genetics of the Norman French, the genetics of the British who were there are very similar. And
Mhm.
so seeing a genetic signal is tough. Right? Um, okay, so anyway, um, uh, a culture, bell beaker culture forms and spreads across Europe, especially Northern Europe. And it seems to be, it must be been some sort of maritime culture because uh, we see lots of bell beaker settlements along the coast and some on rivers. It's clear they were good. They were good uh, sailors. Um, and the genetics are a little unclear. I worked on this myself, and I can't really figure out what's going on, except I'm sure it's complicated. Um, they obviously have a corded ware component. They have some farming component, and I haven't been able to work out all the details yet. And incidentally, there's yet another Y chromosome shows up. They don't have the corded ware Y chromosome. Um, uh, um, the bell beakers move into Britain and completely, 90% at least, replace the population who was there before. Some archaeologists hate that. They don't believe me, but the genetics are obvious, right? So, for example, the famous Stonehenge monument
Mm.
built in 2800, right? The people
Mm.
who built Stonehenge made a negligible genetic contribution to modern Britain.
A fascinating thought that
Yeah,
genetics is the only way to know.
yeah, that's right. Right. I mean, there's actually archaeological papers before we came along that said bell beaker culture spread in Britain by cultural diffusion from the mainland. Well, it didn't. It spread by people arriving.
Mm.
Um, so steppe genetics get into Iberia, 2400 to 2000. And I believe these people did not speak Indo-European. The reason I think that is when you get to Roman times, we have hundreds, probably thousands of place names in Iberia. And in Western Iberia, um, uh, there's hundreds and hundreds of place names that are obviously Celtic. In Eastern Iberia, none at all, right? And they don't, and uh, there's Basque people there, not Indo-European. There's a mysterious language called Iberian, which we can't read, or we have texts, we have Iberian texts, but we can't understand it. And a possible story is that um, the steppe people show up in southern France at least 200 years earlier. Um, at that point, the local people are probably speaking Aquitanian, which seems to be a variety of Basque. No? And I believe they dropped their Indo-European language and and learned to speak the Aquitanian or some similar language, and therefore didn't bring the Indo-European language into Spain at this time. We don't really know, but it's hard to explain a complete absence of Indo-European place names in eastern Spain.
That is an interesting confluence of genetic and linguistic data. That's
Yeah, yeah. Okay, so now we come to something. I worked on this, or at least I worked on the Celtic part. The the sort of dawn of the Iron Age, end of the Bronze Age. We see some movement into Britain from the mainland. That's a reasonable time to place the arrival of Celtic speakers in Britain, right? And I think it's probably right. But a problem is that the genetics is obviously coming from the south, as you might expect. They're crossing they're crossing the English Channel, arriving in southern England, and gradually spreading north. There's no real sign of a shift of genetics in what's now Scotland, right? But the Scots certainly spoke Celtic. What's going on? One possibility is that Proto-Celtic came into Britain with the bell beakers. Okay. But the problem there is that in Caesar's time, we have a number, we know quite a bit about Gaulish, Celtic language spoken in Gaul, and my Celtic experts tell me that Gaulish and insular Celtic in Britain are very similar linguistically. So you place the bell beakers 2,000 years before. Is it really credible that the languages would still be so close? Don't know. I haven't. I think this is an unresolved problem, and I don't know the answer.
yeah, I think that's dicey at that time difference.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Unfortunately, we don't have any relevant DNA from Ireland. See, I want to know, did the same movement into from the mainland happen in Ireland at the same time? And do we see a subtle genetic shift there? But I don't know that. There's no question Celtic speakers move into Iberia, in my opinion, almost certainly by sea. Right? They obviously got to Britain by sea, so I see no reason they couldn't have come into Iberia by sailing down the Atlantic coast. Proto-Italic, we don't really understand when it reached Italy, but I'm optimistic we're going to resolve this. We have in the Reich Lab right now, we have a rich collection of samples from ancient Italy. And I'm optimistic that we'll resolve this issue about when, but we haven't done it at the moment.
Do you think that simultaneously we get a sort of a solution to the classic Italo-Celtic problem?
Yes, I hope so. I mean, it would be very interesting, but wonderful would be to find a European population, say 1300 BC, that appears to be ancestral to both later Celts and Italic speakers. That would probably clinch the issue, but that's pure speculation. And we sort of touched on this earlier. I think my favorite paper in linguistics is Ringe, Taylor, and Warno, 2002. By the way, everyone on the call, if you're interested in historical linguistics, and you must be, or you wouldn't be still on the call, this is a paper that's really worth reading. I think it's absolutely, it's one of my favorite papers in science.
I'll put it in the chat.
Yeah. It's a terrific paper. I'm not sure the results have really been, it's more than 20 years old, but for me, the results look still completely okay. I don't see anything wrong with, and it's interesting. There's a brilliant section on features of IE languages that their model doesn't work for. And pretty much everything that's a problem is Germanic.
Mhm.
And I think that we don't really know what's going on, but that's for me evidence that it's messy. Right? Germanic probably has several sources. You can imagine if you get some sort of mix of languages, a long time ago, 4,000 years ago, you could mix of Indo-European languages that weren't terribly diverged at that time. Sorting it all out could be very hard.
Yeah, the I suppose the summary of it for those unfamiliar, and this was a very quick summary, would be that something that was closer to Baltic became isolated from Baltic, came into close contact with something like the ancestor of Celtic before much differentiation between these branches had existed, and then this
Yeah,
intermediate dialect is what later developed into Germanic.
yeah. But that's a lot to sort out. I don't think it's really been done by, and I doubt if the linguists are going to help much. But we never know. I mean, I doubt if the geneticists are going to help much.
I don't know if
So
linguists will either.
I pretty much get into the end. This is sort of the residue of stuff that I don't really understand so well, and I may not even be completely up to date. Um, so, uh, how did Indo-European get into Greece? Um, we see some step genetics in northern Greece by about 2100, um, probably for Balkans, but that's really geographical. I mean, if stuff is coming in from the Balkans, you expect it to show up in northern Greece first. Um, there's much less step ancestry in Greece, both anciently and to this day, than most of Europe. And ancient Greece is well modeled as Minoan Crete, and then steppe, and maybe a little corded ware. So I think what's going on, we don't really have good data from Greece around 3000 BC, I think. But we have quite a lot of data from Minoan Crete. And that's probably a good match to what's going on in Greece. I mean, I think Crete was settled um, by Neolithic people in Greece. I don't want to call them Greeks, they weren't speaking Greek. Um, uh, and you see Bronze Age Greece as having is very similar to Minoan, but it's shifted towards the steppe. Um, I was hopeful. We know just from the archaeology or even from Homer that Mycenaean Greece was a very stratified society. I mean, you have, and I was hoping that you'd see genetic differences between the elite and commoners. The idea would be that the elite were, Indo-European and the commoners were something else. But that's not true. Um, we have a number of samples from obviously common graves, and we have one spectacular sample called the Griffin Warrior, who is almost certainly a Greek king. He's buried with a gold sword and jewels and goodness knows what else, right? And his genetics is just the same.
Hmm.
I don't know how Indo-European got to Armenia, but it's not obvious it mainly came from Yamnaya. I mean, I think it could have come directly from these Caucasus people, and then some Yamnaya mix in too. And there's work to be done on extinct languages like Phrygian and Illyrian. And I just wanted to mention, because it's just in passing, because I don't think it's actually helpful to analyze really. Albanian, the origin of Albania is obviously complicated, but we have no texts before 1500 AD. And uh, there's a huge number of loan words. I think both from the Balkans and the Greeks and so on. I think it's probably hopeless to figure out what's going on. Oh yeah, and I wanted to make some negative comments here because my Daniel Tabin told me that you may be in a little confusion here. Um, uh, Paul Hegarty and Russell Gray have their own linguistic theories, and I think it's safe to say the geneticists don't believe it. Um, uh, and I don't believe it. They're a very poor fit with everything I've said.
Hmm.
And the results are extremely unconvincing. First of all, they're trying to solve an extremely hard problem. Linguistic change rate is very, very variable, as any good linguist knows. I mean, examples are Old English goes to Modern English, which is a major change, or Old Norse goes to Icelandic. And apparently, Icelanders, modern Icelanders can almost read Old Norse, without a dictionary. The languages are extremely close, and the time periods are very much the same. But of course, the history is very different. Iceland's been linguistically isolated, and England hasn't. So, a huge amount changed. Another problem for Russell Gray, which isn't, but it really needs an explanation, is Alexei Kassian, who's a very good Russian computational linguist, who I recommend. I very much like his work. He has Bayesian machinery that looks awfully similar to Russell Gray's, but he gets completely different dates. So what's going on about that?
Hmm. Hmm.
And finally, and this is very serious for them, for Hegarty and Gray, some of their linguistic split times just don't make sense. They split Old Iranian and Old Indic, basically, Vedic Sanskrit, at like 3,400. But I've just told you there's overwhelming evidence they have a common ancestor on the steppe 1,200 years later. Right? So that
Which,
doesn't work.
which accords much, much better with the linguistics too.
Yeah, I mean, I talked to some of my specialists in this. They just think it's absurd. I mean, the languages are extremely close.
These languages are, I will tell you from firsthand experience, these languages are extremely close. The
Yeah,
Old Avestan material, I mean, it's very opaque, but it is extreme. I mean, with the content of it is extremely opaque. The language itself is so incredibly similar to the Rig Veda. It's really, um,
yeah, yeah.
yeah, remarkable.
So I recently saw an essay, I think probably on Twitter, that I was supposed to call X, saying that our work refutes the step hypothesis. But it doesn't. I, I, I think all he can mean by that is that we don't think the Hittite originated from the steppe. But if you read Antony's book, which I think, basically starts the steppe hypothesis, I don't think Antony doesn't really talk about the Hittites much. He doesn't think there's much evidence that it started from the steppe, and we think it didn't. But pretty much everything else did. So I think that um, I don't understand why Paul is saying that. It's just rather strange. Anyway, I just wanted to flag that there's linguistic work that isn't accepted by many, many people, either in genetics or linguistics.
I
Uh,
appreciate that. We also, I think, agree with your criticisms here. And if he's saying it refutes the step hypothesis, I guess it's a pretty ungenerous interpretation because, of course, no one thinks that that these people have been on the step forever, right? It's but but
I do actually, there is actually a bad form of arguing, which is, straw man. You set up a version of your opponent's beliefs that aren't what he actually believes,
right.
and then proved conclusively that your version is rubbish.
Mhm.
Um, all right. And so conclusions, I think the overall story is pretty clearly right. I'm sure it's wrong in some details. Um, I think archaeology, linguistics, and genetics are remarkably consistent here. Um, Not totally, but I talked to my colleague Joseph Lazaridis, lead author of the recent paper on Indo-European origins. Both Joseph and I think that actually the matchup here is better than you might expect.
Mhm.
Right? You can't expect a 100% match with linguistics and genetics. And for example, the history Hungarians don't speak Indo-European. We know exactly why,
Mhm.
because they were conquered by steppe Magyars in about 800 AD, and they've the Magyars have left essentially no genetic trace in Hungary. The Hungarians look genetically like other Central Europeans. By the way, the Hungarian government doesn't like that.
I'm sure. I'm sure. I, I
Mm-hmm.
I wonder if something along similar lines is going on with Armenian. I mean, because Greek and Armenian are so similar as languages
Yes,
at a deep level.
yes. Right. I actually wondered, um, although the latest genetic data seems to refute it, I did wonder if Greece was settled by Indo-Europeans from the sea.
Hmm.
I mean, you could imagine people leaving Armenia and sailing through the Black Sea and the Bosporus to Greece.
Hmm.
Uh, but I think probably that's wrong. But it is a bit of a mystery. I don't understand the Armenian Greek connection. I haven't really got a story for that.
Hmm. Well, but the fact that there's still questions doesn't mean that the overall model doesn't have some
No, right. I mean,
problems.
you can't expect, stuff happens, and sometimes
Right.
stuff's a bit strange. I mean, um, so that's what I got, guys. Uh, is there any Q&A you want to talk about?
Tony?
I wonder if we could maybe briefly cycle back around to the Anatolian evidence, and I could sort of ask you. You said something interesting to me about this Damgard, the earlier Damgard paper, which I'm familiar with, and I wonder. It's one thing I found a little hard to extract from the most recent article from you and your team, and also to some extent their article, the earlier article on this. It's just well, I guess. I'm trying to get a sense of kind of the robustness of the data, like how many samples and so on we're dealing with from Anatolia at an early, at the very early periods. I mean,
I
you
think,
had this caveat on your slides about how we may not be getting any real Hittite samples,
yeah, I think
and I think
I
that
didn't
yeah.
I didn't work on this myself, so this is sort of from I got a feeling we have very few samples, period, from the early second millennium, sort of, when the Hittite Empire forms and so on.
Mhm. Yes.
We have quite a lot of data later on of Anatolian speakers and so on,
Mhm.
but probably not a lot before like 1200, when the
Mhm.
actual Hittite Empire is collapsing.
Can
Uh,
I like sorry, I guess maybe one thing maybe it's a bit of an ignorant question, but maybe helpful for the other non-specialists in the room. Like when you guys say not a lot, like what is that how does that mean like one or two, or are we
it
talking
can be,
like
what I mean is
20?
probably, I'm making up. I mean, I would say we have less than a dozen.
Less than a dozen? Okay. Yeah, yeah.
But
It's very
I'm not
hard.
sure. I actually should go back to our database and check, because that's from
Mhm.
memory, and I may be wrong.
It's possible that that information can be extracted from the material that's sort of supplementary material
Yeah,
that gets
no, no,
published along for
no,
these,
no.
but I
We
couldn't do
basically,
it.
no, we basically somewhere in the 300 pages of supplement, there will be a list of all the samples we're using.
Mhm.
But
Well,
uh,
there was also a comment in the chat, and I had the same. I always had a sort of a similar question to it. I'm trying to pull it up. Someone asked about you. It was your comment about how you think how maybe one or two of these samples that we do have for say the colony period at Karam Kanesh, how these maybe could be Assyrians rather than Hittites, and I don't. I'm not sure how we would get how we would distinguish between these things.
I think that's just from the archaeology.
Mhm. Well, I mean, they would have both been there during that period. That's kind of the main
Right,
point.
but
It's
I
like,
think
yeah,
I think the archaeologists think that the burial practice was more Assyrian
I
than
see. I
some.
see. Okay. Yeah.
Uh,
I mean, I found this data at least some of what looks like the most recent data. Again, it was a little bit hard for me to tell how much of this was already in the Damgard study and how much is in your the paper for your
yeah,
by
I
your
think
team.
we have quite a lot from later Anatolia that's completely new. and some of those are speaking Anatolian. Um, but that doesn't necessarily tell you much about how Anatolian genetics gets there.
Mhm. No, no, it doesn't. But I guess at least I felt like, oh, at least maybe my sense was that there's some new data
Well,
emerging, and this
I
I think
tell
at
you,
least will get us.
email me so I have your email if I don't already, and I
Mhm.
will look up our database and give you an exact answer.
Okay, I appreciate that. Yeah, thanks. I know this is very hard. I mean, it's an interesting question, obviously, and but it's
But,
yeah.
by the way, something is worth explaining to people who aren't geneticists. You can actually learn a lot about genetic history even from one sample. At least
Mhm.
if the sample is typical of the culture you're looking at. The reason is that the genetics of a human incorporate the genetics of thousands of their ancestors, right?
Hmm.
So you
Mhm.
get a look, in some sense, when you look at just one person, you're actually sampling 1,000 people, maybe more, right? So that can be very helpful. Um, I mean, just one example, which is rather interesting historically. Um, they found a famous Iceman who was on an alpine glacier, uh,
Let's
and
see.
the Iceman dates to about 3,000 BC, and his genetics strongly resemble modern Sardinians. So I wondered if that was, some sort of um, freaky thing. I mean, maybe the Iceman's parents migrated from Sardinia or something. But in fact, we now have a lot more genetics from that period, and we now know that the genetics of this area um, resemble modern Sardinians. So, the Iceman was quite typical of the people he was living in.
And those
Okay.
are early farmers, right?
Yes, that's right.
Pre-Ionian incursion.
He's a European farmer, where the steppe people haven't arrived in that region yet.
Hmm.
Uh,
S-
Um,
Speaking of steppe and Italy, is it thought that steppe ancestry arrives in Italy before 1000 BC? When
yes, I think it actually the steppe ancestry in Italy as early as 2000,
okay.
but how much I'm not sure. Whether it's uniform, I'm not sure, and I doubt a lot whether they were speaking Italic.
Mhm.
Uh,
Mhm.
and of course, the other topic that's fascinating, but you touched on me is the relationship of non-Indo-European languages like Basque and Etruscan to
Yeah,
Indo-European.
I was just thinking about Etruscan and
Etruscan, yeah, it's very interesting, and I don't know. I looked at I looked at the work linking Basque and Indo-European. I don't. The problem there is I don't have a story in which it makes sense. The only two languages that I think could be really grouped correctly at the moment are Indo-European and Uralic. A lot of the Russian linguists link these two. There's a paper by Don Ringe that looks specifically at this and concludes maybe, but there's no evidence, or not enough. No, I didn't say that's wrong. Maybe, but not enough evidence. And
Mhm.
one reason I rather like that hypothesis is there's some reason to think that a lot of the genetics on the Volga River might originate from Siberia. So, going back yet further, there could have been a migrant movement from east to west, from Siberia onto the Volga, very anciently. And of course,
Mhm.
the ancestors of those people could very easily be close to the ancestors of Uralic speakers. Uralic definitely originated in Siberia. All right, I think I said my piece and then some.
I think so. And we
Yeah.
really appreciate your time.
Yeah,
Okay,
this was enormously informative. Thank you for taking the time to
all
talk.
right.
I feel like I learned a lot today.
Well, it was good. Thank you very much, and it was good for me. I clarified some of my thoughts, I think.
Excellent. Well,
Okay.
thank you very much, and for now, wish you and everyone else gathered here all the best. Let me just tell you a little bit about my friends and partners at Grimfrost and about my own current projects. First of all, if you are really into Old Norse products, including my own books or very historically accurate reproductions of Norse jewelry, such as the Thor's hammer pendants, or Norse weapons, or Norse board games, or just cool t-shirts with neat designs, sometimes done by me in runes. The people that you should turn to are the people at Grimfrost. They're good friends of mine. They helped sponsor my great trip to Sweden in 2022 when I visited and made videos about some of the most important runestones there. Check them out and let them know that I sent you. Second, let me tell you a little bit about my projects. My Wanderer's Journal, which will be a blank journal, you know, like this, but cooler, although this one's pretty cool. My brother gave it to me. It will have quotes from Hávamál in Old Norse, rendered by me in Viking Age accurate Younger Futhark, and then rendered artistically by Hackett's Liz Wilson, and then also the Cowboy Hávamál translations of those. The second edition of my Poetic Edda translation will be out probably by the end of 2025. It will include some new translations, some translations of poems, including some that have never been translated into a language other than Old Norse before. And then the Prose Edda should be due probably by the end of 2026.